Welcome back, everyone. I know it's been a little bit, but this is it. This is the rest of the serial killers on our list. If you don't care what I have to say, then you can skip over right here and get to the video. This is about the last 300. That'll make it over 1,000 serial killers over 3 videos. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to watch part 1 and part 2 before watching this one. The entire thing took around 100 man-hours with research, writing, and editing. I am so glad I'm able to finally see the project finished. Furthermore, I'll be releasing the full video uncut, which is about 6 hours long. It's just combining part 1, 2, and 3. I'm also going to have gameplay in the background because this stuff can get pretty graphic. Anyways, let's get right into the video. Philip Jablonski. Born in 1946 in California, Jablonski's father would be drunk and abusive towards him and his family. This would be the cause of his parents divorcing, and Philip lived with his mom. Philip married when he was in high school, and here is when he would start showing signs of a serial killer. He would marry his first wife while he was still in high school. During their sexual times, he would attempt to strangle her unconscious almost every time they had sex. These two would divorce, in which he would instantly remarry another woman and do similar things to her. About 5 years after this new marriage, in late 1972, Jablonski raped a female acquaintance at knife point at her home. The woman would call the police right after, and Philip would be tried and caught. He'd be released around a year later. Philip would get a divorce with his current wife because he told her mother that he was going to rape her, but decided not to last minute. This made the current wife move out of their apartment together and stay with someone else. Around a week later, she went to gather her belongings from the apartment, and she would be found dead later that day. She had been beaten, stabbed, and strangled. Philip would be arrested that same day. However, he was released later after 12 years on parole due to good behavior. Philip would go on to meet another woman, marry her. However, he would then murder her, her child, and her mother, all at the same time. He was apprehended for the final time in 1991, and at first, he would be sentenced to death, but then got a life sentence. Jablonski died on December 27, 2019, of unknown causes at the age of 73. Robert Spangler. Robert was born in 1933 in Iowa, and this guy is pretty disturbing. For starters, in 1978, Robert lured his wife, Nancy, into the basement with a promise of a surprise and shot her in the head with a revolver. Going upstairs, he shot his teenage children, Susan and David. David was slow in dying, so Robert smothered him with a pillow. Robert then altered the scene to make it appear that his wife had shot their children and then herself. Robert was a prime suspect, but of course, it got ruled as a suicide, and most of the evidence was either returned to Spangler or destroyed. However, he would remarry, and with this woman, he would take her hiking and push her to death. After this, he would gain national attention as being a widow twice. He would marry another woman whom he'd had relations with prior. She would be found dead, and it was ruled as an overdose. Robert at first wouldn't be charged with any of these crimes. Police couldn't link the crimes to him, so they had to go after him individually, one by one. It actually took 4 hours of interrogation for Robert to say anything of note. Robert would confess to the crime of his first wife and 2 children, but wouldn't touch either of the other murders. It is agreed that he did commit these murders, just never charged with them. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He died of cancer while incarcerated in federal prison. Nathaniel Burkett. I know I'm jumping the gun. I just want to start this off by saying this dude died of COVID in jail 2 years ago. That's pretty wild, that's all I want to say. Nathaniel was born with polio, and this would give him notice because he walked with a limp. In the late 1970s, Nathaniel would murder a woman and dump her body in the streets of LA. Though Nathaniel was never around the crime scene, he was very drunk and was unable to be interrogated and never charged for any crime. Just a couple of years later, he would douse his mother with gas and light her on fire, killing her in the process. Why he did this is unknown. However, he was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years. He was released after serving 11 years and moved back to Las Vegas shortly after. He would murder 2 more people very close to the spot where he murdered the first woman. These two bodies would be found by passerbys. Nathaniel would go back to prison. However, because he was never registered as a felon, in 2009, then he was in his early 60s, he was released from prison and began to live a quiet life. That was until he was required to submit a DNA sample because of the resurrection of cold cases that would be opened. This pinned him on 3 murders he was never charged with until now. Just 3 years later, he would be arrested for the 1979 murders. He remained in prison until January 19, 2021. He died of complications of COVID-19. Terry Russman. Terry was born in 1943 in Colorado. Terry killed at least 6 people in a series of crimes that spanned decades and stretched across the continental United States, 4 of these murders being a part of his family. In 1985, 4 barrels were found containing all the members of Terry's immediate family, including his wife, her 3 children, one of them being Terry's biological child. These bodies couldn't be confirmed until 24 years later. Terry wouldn't be apprehended for his crime until 2003. He was arrested of that November and pleaded no contest. He died at age 67 in 2010. Randy Gay. Randy was born in 1958, and he is known for slaying his father-in-law and biological father. You see, let me explain. Randy was a failed abortion. His mother abandoned him and his sisters. Their father would try his best, but could never really be a good father figure. Randy's sister would mention that Randy had a continuous drinking problem before and while he got married. He married Sherry Buford, and in 1978, he would get into a dispute with her father, James Kelly, and he got a shotgun from the car and shot him in the chest. Randy claimed self-defense and in a total served less than 2 years in prison for the crime. In 1991, Randy and his significant other Janice were camping. While there, Glenn Gay, Randy's father, came to fish as well. Janice mentions she suddenly heard yelling, and Randy had once again went to go get his shotgun, and this time he locked Janice in the camper they had brought. She heard a gunshot and Randy came to unlock the door. Janice found Randy's father dead. The two put Glenn into a boat to take it to Randy's truck and they drove off. The two actually got away with it for about 2 weeks before police came to question them. Randy acted real calm, but when Janice was questioned, she immediately told police where Randy had hid the body. Randy and Janice were both tried for the crimes and were sentenced 20 years and paroled in 2000. In 2011, Randy had somehow acquired a stranger by the name of Connie Snow in his truck. The two had gotten into an argument while on the road and ordered Connie out of the truck. When at first she said no, he had grabbed his shotgun and finally she attempted to flee. Randy shot her in the face, loaded her in his truck, and buried her about a half-mile away. Randy was captured the next day. He was charged with capital murder and was tried and found guilty of March of 2015. The judge formally sentenced Randy to death the next day. Briley brothers. Linwood Briley, James Briley, Anthony Briley. They were a trio of brothers who were responsible for murder and robbery sprees throughout the mid to late 1970s. Their early life seems pretty normal, and they actually had an older brother among them. However, in his teenage years, he would disappear and live with his older relatives in North Carolina. The trio had normal parents, nothing really to note that was bad. However, when the trio reached their teenage years, their parents had split up. The trio ended up living with their father, and this is where the string of crimes would begin. However, it would start with the second-born Linwood. On January 28, 1971, the first murder was committed by Linwood at the age of 16. While at home alone, Linwood fatally shot Orline Christian, 57-year-old neighbor, with a rifle from his bedroom window as she was hanging out some laundry on a clothesline. The crime actually went almost unnoticed as the family assumed poor health. However, her body was re-examined and a small caliber bullet was found underneath her armpit. A private investigator concluded that the bullet had to have come from the Bailey's house. Once Linwood was questioned, he said, "I heard she had heart problems. She would have died soon anyway." In 1979, the three Briley brothers and an accomplice began the 7-month series of random killings that terrified the city and surrounding region. The first attack occurred on March 12, 1979, when the second brother, the eldest among the trio, knocked on the door of the Henrico couple, claiming that he had car trouble. He eventually forced his way into their home and waved his brothers to come inside. They tied the couple and began stealing an assortment of items, including TV, CB radio, a pistol, and some jewelry. Not before they had poured kerosene across the entire house, lit a match to it, and engulfed the place in flames. The couple were lucky to escape before the house was completely torched. The brothers would continue to kill around 19 more people, usually led by Linwood. The weapons they use are as follows: rifle, cinder block, baseball bat, fork, and pistol. Police happened to be in the general vicinity of the neighborhood and later saw the gang members running down the street at high speed. They did not know where the shots had been fired. The bodies were not discovered until 3 days later, but the brothers were all arrested soon afterward. The youngest brother would have a plea deal with evidence on the other two brothers. He took the offer and provided full detail of the crime spree. As a result, he escaped death penalty, while the other two were electrocuted by an electric chair. William Bonin. William was born in 1947 in Connecticut and was the second of 3 sons. Both of William's parents were alcoholics and weren't the best role models for William. The father would have a gambling problem and would gamble the Bonin's home away and would have to move across the state. Here, William and his brother would be raised Catholic. William would keep himself out of trouble because of fear of his parents, until 1968 when William was 20. He came across a 14-year-old boy named Billy while he was hitchhiking. William would handcuff the boy, grape him, and knock him out. Though he didn't kill the boy, he left his body on a bench at the park. Just 10 days later, however, he would pick up a 17-year-old hitchhiker and do the same thing, except bludgeon him with a tire iron. William would do this to 3 more individuals and potentially many more over the years. In 1980, police observed William driving in a seemingly random manner throughout Hollywood, unsuccessfully attempting to lure 5 separate teenage boys into his van. The police followed him and caught him torturing and raping a 14-year-old boy. The police initially charged him with molestation of a child. However, when they searched the vehicle, they were able to tie him to numerous crimes that called him the freeway killer. He, of course, was found guilty of 10 murders and a magnitude of other crimes. He was sentenced to death for each murder. William was executed by lethal injection chair. Fernando Caro. Fernando was a kidnapper and rapist who killed between 3 and 5 children and teenagers in California from 1979 to 1980. Convicted and sentenced to death for a double murder, he spent the remainder of his life on death row until his death in 2017. He likely died of natural causes. Malcolm Robbins. Malcolm was a serial killer and sex offender who was convicted of raping and murdering at least 3 young boys and 1 teenager in 4 different states from 1979 to 1980. Convicted and sentenced to death in California, he remained on the state's death row until his death in 2023. In 2019, he moved to a different prison. His health had severely declined, and he passed away at age 62. Thomas Bundy. Thomas Bundy, who, from 1979 to 1981, committed a series of murders of young women and girls in the cities of Alaska. At the time of the killings, Bundy was serving the Air Force Base near Fairbanks, and for a long time avoided suspicion. Despite confessing to the crimes, Thomas was not immediately arrested due to a legal mistake and remained at liberty for another 8 days, during which, for unknown reasons, he did not make any effort to evade justice. Alaskan authorities issued an arrest warrant for him in 1983, but he was not immediately arrested in Texas. Riding his motorcycle about 40 miles outside of Texas, Thomas rode into oncoming lane of the highway and collided with the truck. He died almost instantly. The incident was subsequently recognized as a suicide. David Carpenter. David Carpenter is known for stalking and murdering a variety of individuals on hiking trails and state parks near San Francisco. He attacked at least 10 individuals, 2 attempted victims, Stephen Hardell and Lois Rena. Mother of television personality Lisa Rena survived. Carpenter used a .38 caliber handgun in all but one of the killings. a .44 caliber handgun was used in the killing of Edna Kane. I'm super confused because I can't find much more information about his arrest, or if he's in prison, or if he's dead. Randall Woodfield. Woodfield was suspected of multiple sexual assaults and murders. Though convicted only for one murder, he has been linked to a total of 18, and is suspected of having killed up to as many as 44. However, he was only convicted and tried for one murder. He was given a life sentence and is still alive to this day. Arthur Bishop. Arthur was a convicted sex offender and serial killer. In 1983, as a result of a routine police investigation, he confessed to the murders of 5 young boys between 1979 and 1983. He was brought to trial in 1984. He was found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of sexually abusing a minor, and he was sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection. Terry Childs. Terry Childs was an American serial killer, serving several life sentences for the murders of at least 5 people in Nevada and California, spanning from 1979 to 1985. While his true victim count is unknown, he himself has claimed to have killed at least 12 people, and that he had been pressured into confessing these after seeing the ghost of the people that he killed. Terry Childs died in 2023 while incarcerated at Salinas Valley State Prison. Nicholas Sutton. Nicholas Sutton was an American serial killer who was responsible for murdering 2 acquaintances and his own grandmother in North Carolina and Tennessee from August to December 1979. Convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for these crimes, Sutton, among 3 others, later participated in a 1985 prison killing over drugs. For this final crime, he was sentenced to death and executed by 2020 by the electric chair. Joseph D'Angelo. Former police officer and mechanic who committed at least 13 murders, 51 rapes, and 120 burglaries across California between 1974 and 1986. The list is absolutely monumental, and for decades he remained under the radar until April 24, 2018, when the Sacramento County Sheriff's deputies arrested him. On August 21, 2020, D'Angelo received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. D'Angelo offered a brief apology after listening to days of pre-sentencing victim impact statements. "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." In November 2020, D'Angelo was transferred to North Kern State Prison. As of 2021, D'Angelo is incarcerated at that prison. Daniel Seibert. Daniel Seibert is on Alabama's death row. He was convicted of 3 murders and confessed to have at least 5. During questioning, he indicated that he was responsible for at least 12 deaths. He died in 2008 due to complications of cancer. Terry Hyatt. Terry Hyatt is an American serial killer who killed at least 3 women in North Carolina from 1979 to 1987. Convicted and sentenced to death for 2 of them. He was linked to the 3rd via DNA profiling in 2005, pleading guilty and receiving a life term. He is currently housed at Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, awaiting execution. Marvin Irvin. Marvin Irvin was a former police officer who murdered 2 women in Missouri in September and October 1990, and after his arrest, confessed to an additional 1979 murder, which, up to that point, he had been the prime suspect in for years. For all 3 crimes, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Ivan Hill, also known by his nickname, the 60 Freeway Killer, was a serial killer who raped and murdered at least 8 women in LA between 1986 and 1994. Ivan dumped his victims' corpses along the East Highway, known as California State Route 60, contributing to his nickname. Ivan was captured based on DNA profiling nearly a decade after his last murder and was sentenced to death in 2007. William Jackson. William Jackson, along with 2 other accomplices, killed 5 people during robberies in Washington and Oregon from May to August 1980. Convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms in separate trials, in addition to another sentence for escaping from prison. William Jackson is currently serving his sentence in an Oregon prison. Charles Albanese. Charles was an American serial killer who poisoned 3 relatives with arsenic in Illinois from 1980 to 1981 in order to obtain their inheritance, bank funds, real estate, life insurance payouts, and pension proceeds. He was sentenced to death in 2 separate trials and ultimately executed in 1995. Joseph Christopher. Joseph was a serial killer who gained infamy for a series of murders in the early 1980s. He is believed to have killed at least 12 African American men and boys and wounded numerous others. He was subsequently found guilty and sentenced to 60 years in prison. He died in prison due to a rare form of male breast cancer at the age of 37. Stephen McCoy and James Pastor. These 2 were serial killers who murdered at least 3 people in Texas between 1980 and 1981. Both were sentenced to death and executed at Huntsville Unit in Texas via lethal injection. Thomas Crump. Thomas was an American serial killer who killed at least 3 people in New Mexico and Nevada in the span of a few months in 1980, and after being convicted of the crimes, escaped from prison and later killed the 4th victim. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the 3 murders in New Mexico and sentenced to death for the murder in Nevada. Christine Falling. Christine is a female serial killer, being known to have killed 6 toddlers under her supervision. Christine was sentenced to life imprisonment in December 1982, and her confession prevented her from getting the death penalty. Christine is imprisoned at the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida. Paul Stefani. Paul, who is known as the weepy-voiced killer, due to a series of telephone calls he made to police, anonymously reporting his crimes in a remorseful and high-pitched voice. Paul killed 3 women in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. He found out that he had skin cancer and decided to turn himself in. He was only sent to prison for 40 years and died in 1998. John Bolsinger. John was an American serial killer who was posthumously linked to the murders of 3 women in Eugene, Oregon from 1986 to 1988. He was never convicted of the latter homicides, as he committed suicide shortly after the final murder. He was linked to them via DNA analysis from Oregon State Police and Powerbond Nanolabs in 2022. Vernon Clark. Vernon is an American serial killer who sexually assaulted and murdered at least 4 women in the Baltimore metropolitan area between 1980 and 1989. For his known crimes, he was sentenced to multiple terms of life imprisonment and remains a suspect in several cold cases. He is still in prison to this day. Willie Jones. Willie, who killed at least 3 sex workers in Richmond, Virginia between 1980 and 1991, during his trial, Jones said he committed the murders since the victims had to be punished for being sex workers. He later pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder and received 3 consecutive 20-year sentences. Charles Sinclair, also known as the Coin Shop Killer, was an American criminal suspected of various murders of coin shop owners between the early 1980s and the 1990s. Charles has been linked to 11 homicides, 1 attempted murder, and 2 rapes. He targeted coin shop owners in order to rob them of valuable coin collections. His victims were killed to eliminate any witnesses to the event, not out of known or specific malice. On October 30th, 1990, Charles Sinclair died of heart failure at the Anchorage. Herb Baumeister. Herb was an American businessman and suspected serial killer, a resident of the Indianapolis suburb of Indiana. Baumeister was under investigation for murdering over a dozen men in the early 1990s, most of whom were last seen at gay bars. Police found the remains of 11 men, 8 identified, on Herb's property. Herb committed suicide after a warrant was issued for his arrest. He was later linked to a series of murders, at least 11 men along Interstate 70, which occurred in the early 80s and 90s. Tommy Sells. Though only convicted of one murder, for which he received the death penalty and was eventually executed, authorities believe he committed a total of 22 murders. Tommy himself claims that he has murdered over 70 people. Scott Cox. Scott is a suspected American serial killer, convicted on 2 separate counts of homicide in 1993 in Portland, Oregon, and is suspected of many more. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison, but was granted parole in 2013, 5 years early. He is currently serving a post-prison supervision term of life. He is also the prime suspect in 20 unsolved murder cases throughout the United States and Canada, although charges were never brought against him. Kevin Malone. Kevin Malone was an American spree killer who murdered at least 4 people of March in 1981. Convicted of 3 murders but suspected of 5. He was sentenced to death row in both California and Missouri in 1983 and 1984, respectively. He remained on death row until he was extradited in Missouri in 1998 to face execution. He was executed in January 1999. Marion Pruitt. Long story short, Marion was put in a witness protection program and he then committed murders under the alias he was given. He ended up killing 5 people. Pruitt was executed by lethal injection at 8:04 p.m. and pronounced dead at 8:09. David Bullock. David, who killed at least 6 people in New York City between 1981 and January 1982, owing to his unassuming appearance and character, his killing spree was undetected by local police for some time, who were unaware that a serial killer was operating in that area. As of May 2023, Bullock is 62 and is serving his sentence at the Clinton Correctional Facility. Michael Carson and Susan Carson. Convicted for 3 murders between 1981 and 1993 in Northern California and the San Francisco Bay Area, the Carsons initially called a press conference to confess to the murders of 3 people, and then immediately said that they didn't do it and pleaded not guilty. In June of 1984, the Carsons were convicted of the first murder and sentenced to 25 years in prisons. Later, they were convicted of the murders of the other 2 people, for which they received the sentences of 50 years and 75 years, respectively. David Gore. David Gore was an American serial killer who confessed to, and was convicted of, 6 murders in Vero Beach in Indian River County, Florida, in the 1980s. Gore was executed by lethal injection in 2012. He had a tendency to murder young boys by kidnapping them and murdering them. Beora Simmons. Beora was an American serial killer who kidnapped and murdered 3 female victims in Jefferson County, Kentucky, between 1981 and 1983. He also attempted to abduct other women and teenage girls, and one other man was wrongfully jailed for his crimes. Simmons was sentenced to death in 1985, but his sentence was reduced to life in prison. Brandon Thalmer. Brandon was responsible for at least 12 murders of elderly women. The killings occurred between January 1981 and October of 1983. In 1986, Brandon was found guilty of 12 murders and was sentenced to life in prison. Wilbur Jennings. Wilbur, who killed at least 6 girls and women in Sacramento, California between 1981 and 1984, on November 20th, 1986, he was sentenced to death, but died in custody before he could be executed. Michael Ross. Michael was an American serial killer who was executed by the state of Connecticut in 2005. He was the last person executed in Connecticut before the state ended capital punishment in 2012. The Connecticut Supreme Court ruled capital punishment unconstitutional in 2015, converting the sentences of the remaining death row inmates to life without parole. Robert Reuser. In the 1980s, Robert had joined the Nation of Yahweh, a black Hebrew Israelite religious group, and by Halloween 1986, they had killed at least 4 people on behalf of the religious group. Charged, therefore, Robert turned state evidence against the whole group and its leader, and was only sentenced to 22 years in prison. He was paroled after 10, but put into witness protection. After Robert was caught bouncing checks in 1999, he was sentenced to a 25 years to life under California's 3 strikes law in 2001. Robert Silvera. Robert, also known as the Boxcar Killer, is currently serving a double life sentence in Wyoming and is suspected to have killed around 30 people. However, he was only convicted of 2. He is also the head cook in his prison. Michael Swango. Michael, a licensed Ohio physician who is estimated to have been involved in as many as 60 fatal poisonings of patients and colleagues. Although he admitted to only causing 4 deaths, he was sentenced in 2000 to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, and is serving his sentence at the ADX Florence at his own request. Michael Sharp. Michael, who abducted and killed 2 women and 1 girl in West Texas in 1982, is thought to be responsible for at least 2 further murders. Convicted for the first 2 killings and sentenced to death for one of them, Sharp was executed in 1997. He was ultimately executed lethal injection. Frank Spisak. I would just like everyone to pause the video and look up this guy. I'll put it to you this way. He came to his court appearance dressed as Adolf Hitler, and he was a neo-Nazi and committed crimes because of that. He was executed by lethal injection in 2011. William Christensen. William, known as the American Jack the Ripper, was a Canadian-American serial killer who killed and mutilated at least 4 people in Canada and the United States between 1982 and 1983. Suspected in 20 further killings across several countries, in 1990 he died of natural causes. John Joubert. John was convicted of murdering 3 boys in Maine and Nebraska. Joubert then confessed to killing 2 boys on January 12th and was charged with their murders. John was executed in 1996 by the electric chair. Larry Eyler. Larry is believed to have murdered a minimum of 21 teenage boys and young men in the series of killings he committed throughout the Midwest in 1982 and 1984, convicted and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Diane Odell. Diane, who was convicted of murdering 3 of her 12 children, she was also investigated for the disappearance of another child. The bodies of the 3 dead newborns were found in May 2003 in a storage shed Odell rented and abandoned in Arizona. 3 dead newborns were found in May of 2003 in a storage shed Odell rented and abandoned in Arizona. In 2004, she was sentenced to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2029. Dorothea Puente. Dorothea ran a boarding house in Sacramento, California, and she murdered various elderly and mentally disabled boarders before cashing their social security checks. Dorothea's total count reached 9 murders. She was convicted of 3. She died in prison in Chowchilla in 2011 from natural causes. Gary Ridgway. Gary was initially convicted of 48 separate murders, making him the second most prolific serial killer in the United States history, according to confirmed murders. He killed many teenage girls and women in the state of Washington during the 1980s and 1990s. Later advances allowed investigators to definitively link Ridgway to the murders, and he was later arrested on November 30th, 2001. David Gore. David Gore was a serial killer who confessed to and convicted of 6 murders in Vero Beach and Indian River County in Florida in the 1980s. David was executed by lethal injection in 2012. He had a tendency to murder young boys by kidnapping them and then murdering them. Mark Cunningham. Mark Cunningham, who shot and killed 3 men at random in Santa Cruz, California from April to June 1983, the murders were not linked together until months later, when forensic evidence concluded that victims had been shot with the same gun. Cunningham was arrested the following year, was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison in 1988. Anthony Joyner. Anthony, who raped and murdered at least 6 elderly women at a nursing home in Philadelphia from January to July 1983, but is suspected in 18 total deaths that occurred there. Tried and convicted only for his confirmed murders, he was sentenced to life in prison. Anthony Sully. Anthony was a serial killer and police officer responsible for the murders of 6 people between February and August 1983 at his warehouse in California. Sully placed some of his corpses of the victims in metal drums and poured concrete over them, after which he dumped them in the Golden Gate Park. At least 3 people acted as accomplices in the crimes, but they never reported his activities to police. Anthony would later be found guilty of the killings in 1986 and was sentenced to death. Larry White. Larry, who shot to death 3 women in Kentucky from June to July 1983, originally convicted of 2 murders for which he was sentenced to death. His sentence was later overturned, and White was paroled. After being in prison for firearm violations in 2006, he was linked to his first murder via DNA and given a new death sentence and is currently awaiting execution for it. Milton Johnson. Milton was a serial killer and mass murderer who committed 10 known murders and a series of murders that spanned over 3 months in Illinois. 2 of his victims were police officers. William Thompson. William, convicted for 3 murders committed between March and April 1984 in California and Nevada. He later admitted 3 additional murders in 3 other states, which were never sustained. Sentenced to death for the Nevada killing, he withdrew his appeals. He was subsequently executed in 1989. Leonard Lake, Charles Ng. These 2 murdered an estimated 11 to 25 victims at a remote cabin near California in the Sierra Nevada foothills. After his 1985 arrest on unrelated charges, Lake swallowed cyanide pills that he had sewn into his clothing and died 4 days later. Human remains, videotapes, and journals found at Lake's cabin later confirmed Charles' involvement and were used to convict Charles on 11 counts of capital murder. Dayton Rogers. Dayton, who's an American serial killer who has been tied to the murders of at least 8 women. He preferred street women, usually addicts, sex workers, and runaways. The bodies of 6 of the women were found at a dump site located on privately owned forest lands outside Oregon, and thus he was dubbed the Motala Forest Murderer. On December 13, 2022, Governor Kate Brown commuted the death sentence of everyone on Oregon's death row. He is living life without parole. David Morton. David was an American serial killer and rapist who murdered at least 3 women in New Mexico and Texas between 1983 and 1990. Finally arrested shortly after the final murder, Morton confessed to his previous crimes and is now serving 2 different life sentences in both states. Homer Jackson. Homer was an American serial killer who killed at least 3 women and 1 teenager in Oregon from 1983 to 1993. The killings remained unsolved until forensic evidence led to his arrest in 2015. Edward Mariand. Edward, who strangled 3 women in New England between 1983 and 1994, convicted of the 1994 murder of the 3rd woman that he killed in Rhode Island. He died in prison from lung cancer before he could be charged with 2 other deaths in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, to which he posthumously linked via DNA. Jack Jones. Jack Jones, who murdered at least 3 women in Florida and Arkansas between 1983 and 1995, convicted of 2 murders during his lifetime and executed in 2017. He was posthumously linked via DNA to the 3rd murder, for which another man was imprisoned. Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown. These 2 committed a crime spree across 6 states between May and July of 1984 that resulted in the deaths of 8 people. Coleman, who received death sentences in 3 states, was executed by the state of Ohio. Deborah was sentenced to death in Ohio and Indiana, but the sentences were later reduced to life imprisonment, without parole, in 140 years, respectively. Fernando Cota. Fernando, who was the prime suspect in the murders of 6 women in San Jose, California from September to October 1984. He committed suicide on October 14, 1984, after he was arrested for a botched kidnapping. Alvin Kelly. Alvin, who committed 4 drug-related murders in Longview and Lake Cherokee, Texas from May to June 1984, killing 2 reserve marshals and their infant son, and later his roommate. Convicted and sentenced to death for the infant's murder. He was executed in 2008. He eventually exhausted all of his appeals and he was scheduled for execution on October 14, 2008. Raymond Lasser. Raymond, who strangled to death 3 women and attempted to murder a 4th in the span of over a little 2 months in 1984. He later became the first criminal to be successfully prosecuted under the newly enacted Rhode Island Life Without Parole statute, headed by prosecutor Jeffrey B. Pine, and promptly received life imprisonment without parole for his crimes. Christopher Wilder. Christopher, who abducted and raped at least 12 young women and girls, torturing and killing at least 8 of them during a 6-week cross-country crime spree in the United States. Wilder's series of murders began in Florida in 1984 and continued across the country. Christopher was killed during a struggle with police in New Hampshire on April 13, 1984. Since his death, he has also been considered a suspect in many unsolved murders. Richard Ramirez, a very well-known serial killer, dubbed the Night Stalker, was an American serial killer and sex offender whose crime spree took place in California between June 1984 and August 1985. He is suspected to have killed more than 15 people. What was most well known about him is that he went on the popular show The Dating Game. At the point of the show, which being aired, he is said to have killed most of his people while he was on it. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 1989. He died in 2013 while awaiting execution. Anthony Wimberly. Between December 1984 and January 1985, he murdered 3 women in Oakland for the purpose of robbery, as well as raping a 12-year-old girl. After his arrest, he confessed to his crimes and was later given 3 life sentences. Farion Wardrip. Wardrip, who assaulted and murdered a total of 5 women, his killing spree began at the end of 1984 and lasted until the middle of 1986. All of his female victims were white, between the ages of 20 and 25, and weighed less than 120 pounds. He later confessed to the murders of the 3rd and 4th victims in 1999, at 40 years old. He was sentenced to death by lethal injection for the first murder, and 3 life terms for the other killings. Robert Berdea. Robert, who kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 6 young men after having forced them to endure periods of up to 6 weeks of captivity. His crimes took place in Kansas City and Missouri between 1984 and 1987. Robert pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of one of his victims. In August 1988, he would later plead guilty to 1 further charge of first-degree murder and 4 charges of second-degree murder. He died of a heart attack while incarcerated at the Missouri State Penitentiary in October of 1992. Nathaniel Code. Nathaniel, who committed at least 8 murders in the city of Shreveport, Louisiana, between 1984 and 1987. He was sentenced to death in 1990 for 4 of these killings and has been awaiting execution ever since. Louis Crane. Louis, who committed at least 4 great murders in South LA in the period between 1985 and 1987. He was convicted for these crimes in 1989 and was sentenced to death, where he died on November 3, 1989 from AIDS complications. Melvin Johnson. Melvin, posthumously linked to at least 4 murders committed in Illinois from 1984 to 1988, 3 of which were sexually motivated. He was never convicted of murder during his lifetime and died before he could be brought to trial for his crimes. Timothy Spencer. Timothy, who committed 3 rapes and murders in Virginia. Timothy became the first serial killer in the United States to be convicted on the basis of DNA evidence. He was put to death in the electric chair. Robert Rodriguez. Robert was an American serial killer and former police officer, responsible for murdering 2 girls and a woman in Florida in 1984 and 1992, respectively. Although never charged with the murders, he left a note confessing to the crimes when he committed suicide in New Mexico. John Robinson. John Robinson was an American serial killer, con man, embezzler, kidnapper, and forger who was found guilty in 2003 for 3 murders committed in and around Kansas City, receiving the death penalty for 2 of them. In 2005, he admitted responsibility for 5 further homicides in Missouri as part of a plea bargain to receive multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, and avoid more death sentences. Investigators suspect that more victims remain undiscovered. Anthony McKnight. Between September 1985 and January 1986, Anthony attacked 10 women in Oakland, California, killing 5 of them. In 2008, he was found guilty of these murders and sentenced to death, but died awaiting execution in 2019. Curtis Brown. Curtis Brown, who raped and murdered 3 women around Arlington and Fort Worth, Texas between 1985 and 1986. Though he is suspected of up to 18 murders, convicted of 1 murder in 1987. In 2009, he was convicted of the 2 additional murders from 1985, based on result of DNA profiling. Ricky Green. Ricky murdered at least 4 people in Texas between 1985 and 1986, at least 2 of which were killed with the help of his wife, Sharon. Convicted of all 4 murders and sentenced to death in 1, Green was executed at the Huntsville unit in 1997. Michael Terry. Michael was active between 1985 and 1986. He killed 6 gay men in Georgia following sexual encounters. Whilst he claimed they were done in self-defense, Terry was nevertheless convicted and given 3 life imprisonment terms, which he is still serving. Frank Walls. Frank, who has been sentenced to death for murdering 5 people in Ocean City, Florida between 1985 and 1987. His murders were robbery-based, and his preferred weapon of choice was a knife or a gun. He was arrested at the age of 19 on July 24, 1987, making him one of the youngest serial killers in American history. He was sentenced to death in 1991, but was retried and sentenced to death again in 1994. Jerry Little. Jerry, who killed 4 women in St. Louis, Missouri between 1985 and 1988, at the time of his arrest, the 32-year-old was an avid recidivist, which means he kept going in and out of prison. Who had spent more than 17 years of his life behind bars. In 1990, he was sentenced to full life imprisonment. Donald Evans. Donald murdered at least 3 people from 1985 to 1991. He was most known for confessing to his killings at parks and rest areas across more than 20 U.S. states. Donald was stabbed to death in 1999 by a fellow death row inmate at the Mississippi State Penitentiary while in the shower. Juan Chavez. Juan was an American serial killer and spree killer who, together with a teenage accomplice, killed 11 people in Texas during a crime spree lasting from March to July 1995. Shortly after being paroled from prison for a murder conviction for the latter crimes, Juan was sentenced to death and subsequently executed in 2003. Lonnie Franklin Jr. Lonnie, better known by the nickname the Grim Sleeper, was an American serial killer. Better known as the Grim Sleeper, was an American serial killer who is responsible for at least 10 murders and 1 attempted murder in LA, California from 1984 to 2007. He was also convicted for rape and sexual violence. Franklin earned his nickname when he appeared to have taken a 14 break from his crimes from 1988 to 2002. On March 28, 2020, Franklin was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. Danny Figueroa, known as the Backwoods Sniper, was an American serial killer who shot and killed 3 people in Southern California within the span of 2 months in 1986. A self-described survivalist, he killed his victims in rural woodland areas in Riverside and San Bernardino counties. He pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder in 1987 and was sentenced to 66 years to life in prison. Richard Hunter. Richard killed 4 elderly women in Atlanta between March and April 1986, robbing their apartments afterwards. He later pleaded guilty to the murders and numerous robberies and was sentenced to life imprisonment and is still alive to this day. Manuel Pardo. Manuel, a former police officer who had previously been employed by the Florida Highway Patrol, Manuel had 9 known victims. These events led to his arrest and conviction for 9 counts of first-degree murder in the mid-1980s, which he received the death penalty for, and ultimately his execution in December of 2012. He was executed in Florida by lethal injection. Michael Player. Michael, who committed a total of 10 murders in the LA neighborhood of Skid Row, earning the nickname the Skid Road Slayer. In 1986, Michael Player shot himself in LA in a LA hotel while he was on the run. David Rundle. David murdered 3 young women in Sacramento, California, and Placer County over 6 months in 1986. He blamed his actions on mental illness and the abuse he received as a child. Convicted of all 3 murders, he was sentenced to death for 2 of them. He is currently on death row. Oscar Bolin. Oscar kidnapped and murdered 3 young women in Florida. He was later connected to a 4th murder in Texas in 1987. The murders went unsolved for nearly 4 years until the husband of his ex-wife called the tip line and implicated him as the killer. He maintained his innocence to the end. Bolin was executed by lethal injection. Charles Boyd. Charles, between 1986 and 1987, committed the rape and murders of 3 women in North Dallas. Tried for one of the murders, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Charles was later executed by lethal injection in 1999. Edward Castro. Edward fatally stabbed 3 men across Florida between late 1986 and early 1987. Tried for 2 of the murders, he was given a life sentence for one of them and sentenced to death for the other. He waived all of his appeals and dropped his defense team, telling the courts he just wanted to be executed. Edward was executed at the Florida State Prison by lethal injection in 2000. Harrison Graham. Harrison, who murdered 7 women in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania between mid-1986 to 1987, keeping their remains in his apartment. In 1988, he was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death, but his sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment. Harrison lived less than a mile and a half away from another murderer. Ronald Gray. Ronald was charged with 4 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder and 8 counts of rape. His crimes were committed when he was at the United States Army, stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. President George Bush authorized Gray's execution in 2008. He killed 4 military women and 1 civilian. John Kelly. John, following his 2012 arrest for the 1986 rape and murder of a hitchhiker in California, John additionally confessed to murdering a couple 2 years later in Jedediah Smith Redwood State Park near Crescent City. For all of his crimes, he received 3 life imprisonment terms, which he is currently serving at the California Correctional Institute. Faye and Ray Copeland. At the ages of 69 and 76 respectively, the oldest couple ever sentenced to death in the United States. They were convicted of killing 5 drifters at their farm in Mooresville, Missouri. When their sentences were commuted to life in prison in 1999, Faye Copeland was the oldest woman on death row. They both ended up dying of natural causes. Juan Chavez. Juan was an American serial killer and spree killer who, together with a teenage accomplice, killed 11 people in Dallas during a crime spree lasting from March to July 1995. Shortly after being paroled from a prison for a murder conviction for the latter crimes, Juan was sentenced to death and subsequently executed in 2003. Joseph Danks. Joseph was an American spree killer and serial killer who killed 6 homeless men in January 1987 in Los Angeles, Koreatown neighborhood. Convicted of the 6 killings and sent to serve his life sentence at the California Correctional Institute in Tecahapi. He was sentenced to death in 1990 for the murder of his cellmate. Joseph Miller, who raped and murdered at least 5 women in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania from 1986 and 1990. In 1993, he was convicted and sentenced to death, but it was later commuted to life imprisonment without the chance of parole. Michael Hughes. Hughes was initially sentenced to life without parole for the murders of 4 women and girls in California. Later, he was convicted of committing 3 further murders of women, linked to the crimes via DNA profiling. At the second trial, he was sentenced to the death penalty. Hughes is awaiting execution on death row. Alexander Watson. Initially convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment for the 1994 murder of a woman in Maryland, Watson's DNA was later matched to 3 additional killings in Andrew County, committed years before. For these crimes, he pleaded guilty and received 4 additional life imprisonment terms. Anthony Shore. Anthony was responsible for the murders of 3 girls. He was active from 1986 to 2000 and became known as the Tourniquet Killer because of his use of a ligature in either a toothbrush or bamboo stick to tighten or loosen the ligature. The instrument was similar to a garrote, or a twitch, a tool used by farmers to control horses. Anthony was sentenced to death in 2004 and executed by lethal injection in 2018. Andrew Uridalis. Andrew was an American serial killer who was convicted in Illinois in 2002 of killing 3 women and convicted in California in 2018 for killing 5 women. He was sentenced to death in California and died by suicide a few months later. Mervyn Hughes. Mervyn is an American serial killer who shot and killed 1 man in 1986 and later shot and killed 2 more people during a January 1999 shooting spree in Oakland, which also injured 10 others. Hughes was sentenced to death in 2005 and remains on death row. Angel Residez. Angel was suspected in as many as 23 murders across the United States and Mexico during the 1990s. Some also involved sexual assault. He became known as the Railroad Killer, as most of his crimes were committed near railroads, where he had jumped off the trains that he was using to travel around the country. He was convicted of capital murder in Texas and executed by lethal injection in 2006. David Corwin. David was an American serial killer who was sentenced to death and executed for murdering 3 women. Daniel was executed by lethal injection in 1998. Franklin Lynch. Franklin was convicted of the murders of 3 elderly women in successive months during the summer of 1987. Franklin is the prime suspect in 10 other murders of elderly women that took place in San Leandro, which were publicly called the Daystalk murders. Circumstantial evidence links him to a total of 13 murders. Paul Rhodes. Paul was an American spree killer and suspected serial killer, convicted of the murders committed in Idaho during a 3-week crime spree in 1987. He is the prime suspect in at least 4 additional killings in Utah and Wyoming, dating back to 1984. He was executed for 2 of his confirmed murders in 2011. Michael Torrance. Michael was an American serial killer responsible for the murders of 3 people in South Carolina from February to March 1987, 2 of which were committed with the help of his brother and his brother's wife, Donna. Sentenced to death for 1 murder and 2 life terms, Michael successfully volunteered for his execution, dropping all appeals against the wishes of his public defender, and was executed in 1996. David and Kathy Wood. Killed at least 6 girls and women in El Paso, Texas between May and August 1987, burying their bodies in the desert. While he has denied culpability for the crimes, he was nonetheless convicted and sentenced to death. Michael Lockhart. Michael was an American serial killer who received death sentences in 3 states. He was caught while attempting to steal a Corvette. He was executed on December 9, 1997, by the state of Texas. Harry Greenwald. Harry was an American serial killer and rapist who committed at least 3 murders along Interstate 65 in Indiana and Kentucky between 1987 and 1989. The killings were linked to Greenwald via DNA in 2022, but he died of cancer in 2013. Craig Price. Craig is an American serial killer who committed his crimes in Warwick, Rhode Island between the ages of 13 and 15. He was arrested in 1989 for 4 murders committed in his neighborhood, a woman and her 2 daughters that year, and the murder of another woman 2 years earlier. Dorothy Williams. Dorothy killed 3 elderly people during robberies in Illinois between 1987 and 1990. Initially sentenced to death, her death sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole in 2003. Patrick Baxter. Patrick, who raped and killed 2 women and a teenage girl in Westchester County, New York between 1987 and 1990. Due to DNA profiling, Patrick was arrested for the murders in 2000 while serving a sentence for car theft and was convicted and sentenced to 25 years to life imprisonment. Andrew Edwards. Andrew, a jobless drifter, Edwards murdered 4 fellow itinerants across 3 states between 1987 and 1992 in alcohol-induced rages, and attempted to murder a 5th in 1993 following his last attack. He was arrested and subsequently confessed to the murders, receiving a sentence of life imprisonment for his crimes. He is still alive, serving his life sentence. Clifton Ray. Clifton was responsible for at least 3 murders in Kansas City, Missouri between 1987 and 1992, and is suspected in 6 other murders. Ray was convicted of murdering his neighbor in 1995, and was soon going to be eligible for parole until DNA profiling exposed his responsibility in the murders of 2 others. Ray has remained in various prison facilities. As of September 2023, Ray is currently housed at the Jefferson City Correctional Center. Chester Turner. Chester, who was sentenced to death for sexually assaulting and murdering 14 women in LA between 1987 and 1998, he is currently on death row at San Quentin State Prison. Delmas Colvin. Delmas, who committed a series of at least 8 murders against girls and women engaged in prostitution in New Jersey and Ohio between 1987 and 2005. He was arrested thanks to DNA profiling examination. Colvin was convicted of White's murder and received an additional 30 years imprisonment to be served concurrently with his life sentences. Anthony Kirkland. Kirkland murdered 2 women and 2 girls in the Cincinnati area following a 16-year prison term for the 1987 killing of his girlfriend. Anthony is presently incarcerated at Chillicothe Correctional Institute in Ohio. Jeffrey Fellner. Jeffrey, a former nurse's aide who smothered 7 patients to death from 1988 to 1989 at the hospitals he worked at. After initially confessing, but later recanting his statements, he pleaded guilty of 2 of the murders in exchange for a 25 to life sentence. no further charges in the murders, and no further charges in the murders. A few years after his conviction, he died behind bars from AIDS complications. Lyndon Pace. Between 1988 and 1989, Lyndon robbed and killed elderly women, primarily in Atlanta's Vine City neighborhood. Pace was convicted of 4 murders, but was not tried for a 5th, and was sentenced to death for his crimes. As of 2020, he remains on Georgia's death row. Alfredo Prieto. Alfredo, being initially convicted of a single murder, he would later be connected to 8 other murders committed in Virginia and California between 1988 and September 1990 via DNA profiling. Sentenced to death in both states, Alfredo was executed by lethal injection in Virginia in 2015. Elfren Salvador. Elfren, who murdered patients while working as a respiratory therapist on March 12, 2002 at age 32, Salvador pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder and received 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Elfren is incarcerated at the California State Prison. James Bradley. James, who murdered his stepdaughter in 1988 and 2 other women in North Carolina in 2013 and 2014, it's actually pretty gruesome, but he stated he snapped and choked a girl, wrapping a sock around her neck. And once he got out for that, he killed 2 other women, which their bodies were found in garbage bags. The jury spared Bradley's life when they deadlocked during the sentencing phasing, and he was instead sentenced to life in prison without parole. He is currently serving his sentence at Tabor City Correctional Institution. Wesley Dodd. In 1989, he sexually assaulted and murdered 3 boys in Vancouver, Washington. He was arrested later that year after a failed attempt to abduct a 6-year-old boy at a movie theater. Dodd wrote detailed accounts of his murders in a diary that was found by police. After pleading guilty to the charges of murder, he received the death penalty. Oba Chandler. Oba was an American convicted murderer who was executed in Florida for the murder of Joan Rogers and her 2 teenage daughters. The women's bodies were found floating in the Tampa Bay in June 1989. They had been bound, gagged, and then tossed into the bay with concrete blocks tied to their necks while still alive. Chandler was arrested in September 1992. He was executed in 2011 by lethal injection. Danny Rolling. Danny, who murdered 5 students in Gainesville, Florida, over 4 days in August 1990, he later confessed to raping several of his victims, committing a triple homicide in his home state of Louisiana. He was sentenced to death for the 5 Gainesville murders in 1994. He was executed by lethal injection in 2006. Eileen Wuornos. In 1999 to 1990, while engaging in street prostitution along highways in Florida, she shot dead and robbed 7 of her male clients. Eileen claimed that her clients had either raped or attempted to rape her, and that the homicides of the men were committed in self-defense. Eileen was sentenced to death for 6 of the murders. She was executed on October 9, 2002, by lethal injection after spending more than 10 years on Florida's death row. Thomas Dillon. Thomas was an American serial killer who shot and killed at least 5 men in southeastern Ohio, beginning April 1, 1989, and continuing until April 1992. Dillon was hospitalized on October 4th and on October 21, 2011. He died in the prison wing at the Corrections Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio, at the age of 61. Scott Erskine. Scott was convicted in 2003 for the 1993 murder of 2 California boys. He was incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison. In 2020, Scott became one of a dozen California death row inmates to die in the span of less than 2 months as a result of a COVID-19 outbreak at the prison. Lorenzo Fain. Between 1989 and 1993, Lorenzo murdered 1 woman and 5 children in the states of Wisconsin and Illinois in 2001. He was convicted and sentenced to death. However, a year later, the judge imposed a moratorium on capital punishment, commuting all prisoners who were sentenced to life in prison. Joel Rifkin. Joel, who was sentenced to 203 years for the murders of 9 women between 1989 and 1993, though it is believed he has killed as many as 17 people. He was found guilty of 9 counts of second-degree murder in 1994. Kirsten Gilbert. Kirsten was a former nurse who was convicted of 4 murders and 2 attempted murders of patients admitted to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. She induced cardiac arrest in patients by injecting their intravenous therapy bags with massive doses of epinephrine, commonly known as the adrenaline, which is an untraceable heart stimulant. Linwood Fort. Linwood was linked via DNA to a series of rapes and murders committed in Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1990 and is the prime suspect in an unrelated murder in 1994. He was convicted of his confirmed crimes and subsequently sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution. Donna Perry, our first trans killer. Assigned male at birth, she was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder in 2014 for killing 3 women in 1990. She is currently detained at the Washington Correction Center for Women in Gig Harbor, Washington. Cleophas Prince. Cleophas was a serial killer who was convicted and sentenced to death in 1993 for the rape and murder of 6 women in San Diego County, California, from January through September 1990. Before these crimes, and while serving in the United States Navy, Prince was court-martialed in 1989 due to larceny. Upon being convicted, he was recommended to be discharged after serving his sentence. Multiple books have been written on Prince and his crimes. George Russell. Responsible for the murders of 3 women in Seattle over the summer of 1990. After killing his victims, he would mutilate and have sex with the corpse, leaving the bodies posed in bizarre positions at the crime scene for his crimes. He was sentenced to 2 life imprisonment terms and is currently imprisoned at Calm Bay Correction Center. Alberto Seta. Alberto, who struck New York City from 1990 to 1993 before being caught on June 18, 1896. Seta killed 3 people and wounded 6 others. Seta was formally charged in the case on June 21, 1996, convicted in 1998, and was sentenced to 232 years imprisonment. Henry Wallace. Henry, who killed 11 black women in South Carolina and North Carolina from March 1990 to March 1994. He is currently awaiting execution at Central Prison in Raleigh. He was known as the Taco Bell Killer because most of his victims were employees of his because he had managed a Taco Bell. Keith Jesperson. He was known as the Happy Face Killer because he drew smiley faces on his many letters to the media and authorities. Many of his victims were sex workers and transients who had no connection to him. Strangulation was Keith's preferred method of murdering. Keith is currently serving a sentence of life without parole at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Robert Brashers. Robert, who committed at least 3 murders from 1990 to 1998 in the states of South Carolina and Missouri, he committed suicide to avoid arrest for an unrelated crime. It was not identified as the killer until 2018 by C.C. Moore with the help of improved DNA technology. While on the run for his last crime, Robert took his wife, daughter, and 2 stepdaughters hostage. After 4 hours of negotiations, he released 5 hostages and attempted to shoot himself in the head. He was still alive for 6 days after the wound. He released the 5 hostages and attempted to shoot himself in the head. He was still alive for 6 days and died from the wound. Edward McGregor. Edward murdered 4 women in the greater Houston area between 1990 and 2006 with the use of DNA evidence. Edward was convicted in 2010 for one of the murders and was sentenced to life in prison. Edward was only prosecuted in the Wildman's murder and he went to trial in 2010. Since Edward was only 17 years old at the time, prosecutors could not seek the death penalty, instead sought a life sentence. Edward was found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 15 years served. Philip Engel. Philip was an American serial killer who murdered 2 elderly couples in Cherryville, North Carolina in 1991. After being sentenced to death, he waived his appeals, saying that he wanted to spare the families of his victims from any more pain. He was executed in 1995. Earl Richmond. Earl committed 4 murders, including those of 2 children, in New Jersey and North Carolina in 1991. Following his arrest for the murder, he was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in 2005. Benjamin Atkins. Benjamin, who murdered, tortured, and raped 11 women in Highland Park and Detroit, Michigan, during a period of 8 months between December 1991 and August 1992. Shortly after his convictions, he was rushed to a nearby hospital where he died on September 17, 1997, from an AIDS-related illness. Jerome Dennis. Jerome kidnapped and murdered 5 women and girls in 2 cities in Essex County, New Jersey, between 1991 and 1992. After his arrest, he pleaded guilty and was later sentenced to life imprisonment in 1993. Harnoko Diwantoro. Harnoko killed 3 people in LA, California, between 1991 and 1992. Despite committing the crimes of the territory of the United States, he was convicted of all 3 murders by an Indonesian court and was sentenced to death. He was paroled in 2019 from President Joko Widodo. Alan Newman. Alan, in a crime spree lasting nearly 2 years across 3 states, committed 4 murders and a dozen bank robberies prior to his capture in West Virginia. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for his crimes, and he was imprisoned at Jessup Correctional Institution, where he was found dead in his cell in 2000. Nathaniel White. In and near Orange County, New York, during the early 1990s, Nathaniel confessed to beating and stabbing 6 women to death while on parole. Nathaniel was convicted on all counts on April 14, 1993, and sentenced by Judge Jeffrey to 150 years to life. He is currently being held at the Elmira Correctional Facility. Caesar Barone. Caesar was sentenced to death in 1995 for assaulting and killing 4 women in the Portland area between 1991 and 1993. However, Caesar died awaiting execution in 2009 on December 24, 2009. Edwin Caprat. Edwin, who committed 6 murders in Tampa and Hernando County, Florida from 1991 to 1993, and majority of his victims being elderly women, convicted for the 2 killings and sentenced to death. He and another inmate were stabbed to death during a dispute in prison. Robert Shulman. Robert was a postal worker from Hickville, New York, on Long Island, and was convicted of murdering 5 women between 1991 and 1996. The year when he was arrested, Shulman died on April 13, 2006, in Albany, New York, of undisclosed causes. Aaron Key. Aaron was an American serial killer and serial rapist who is responsible for 4 rapes and at least 3 murders of teenage girls in different street blocks of East Harlem, located in Manhattan, New York, from 1991 to 1998. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison. Malik, who killed at least 3 people, including his son and daughter, in Maryland between 1991 and 2019, he is suspected of killing his wife in 1976 and girlfriend's daughter and granddaughter in 2006. A pre-sentencing report in 1976 called him a smooth liar and a smooth talker, and he was skilled at misrepresenting himself. In October 2021, Malik was convicted of second-degree murder and unauthorized disposal of a human body. He was acquitted of first-degree murder. Harvey Robinson. Harvey was a serial killer currently imprisoned on death row in Pennsylvania. He was 18 when he committed his violent spree, killing 3 and injuring 2. Harvey is currently imprisoned on death row in Pennsylvania. William Sapp. William, who committed the murders of 3 women and girls in Ohio in 1992 and 1993, he attempted to murder another and possible 4th in Florida. William was detained for the murders in 1996. and he was sentenced to death in 1999. He is currently awaiting execution. John Armstrong. John, who was convicted of killing 5 female sex workers in Michigan, but is believed to have murdered at least 6 more between 1992 and 1999. He is currently serving life in prison. Gregory McKnight. Gregory murdered 2 people and buried their bodies on his property in Ohio in 2000. He had previously been convicted for a 1992 murder in Columbus. Gregory was sentenced to death in 2002. Desmond Jennings. While officials only conclusively proved his guilt in 5 murders, suspected him in as many as 20. Desmond was executed by lethal injection on November 17, 1999. James Swan. James, whose random drive-by shotgun shootings in Washington, D.C. in 1993 earned him his nickname in the press. James killed 4 people and injured 5 in 14 attacks, before he was apprehended by police in 1993. He was ruled not guilty due to being insane. He said that the voices of Malcolm X told him to kill people. He is still alive in a mental institution to this day. Orville Majors. Though he was tried for only 7 murders and convicted of 6, it was reported that he murdered patients who he claimed were demanding, whiny, or disproportionately adding to his workload. He was served his sentence at Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. Glenn Rogers. Glenn was convicted of 2 murders and is a suspect in numerous others throughout the United States. He is considered a possible alternative suspect to O.J. Simpson in the 1994 murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Rogers was scheduled to be executed on Valentine's Day, but he is still alive to this day. Andre Crawford. Andre, who killed 11 women between 1993 and 1999 in Chicago, many of the women were addicted to drugs or worked as sex workers. He also had sex with their corpses. In 2009, Crawford was guilty on all counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Michael Gargillo. He moved to Southern California in the 1990s and gained the nickname the Hollywood Ripper. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death on July 16, 2021. He is currently incarcerated in San Quentin State Prison. Gary Bowles. Gary was executed in 2019 for the murders of 6 men in 1994. Gary was executed by lethal injection in 2019. Leon Dorsey. Leon was an American serial killer who was executed in 2008 for the murders of 2 Blockbuster store employees. Leon murdered the 2 men and a Korean store clerk during a rampage in Texas in 1994. He confessed and was later given a death sentence. He was executed at the Huntsville unit in 2008. Dana Gray. Dana, who murdered 3 elderly women in 1994, was caught after a 4th intended victim survived and identified her. Dana says she committed the murders to support her spending habits. She is serving her sentence in the California Women's Prison in Chowchilla. Rory Conde. Rory, who killed 6 prostitutes in Florida over a span of 5 months from September to January, he was sentenced to death on March 7, 2000, and he has been on Florida's death row ever since. Anthony Ballum. Anthony murdered 4 prostitutes between 1994 and 1996 in Trenton, New Jersey, luring them with sex for drugs encounters. Anthony was captured after his would-be 5th victim escaped and was later given a life sentence for his crimes. Leslie Burchart, who killed 3 homeless men and wounded a 4th in Richmond, Virginia from 1994 to 1996. He died behind bars for his original convictions in 2002. Eric Matthews. Eric, who killed 2 of his ex-girlfriends in Indiana in 1994, followed by his wife and stepson in 1998. Additionally linked to 2 rapes while on the run, he was arrested and put on trial after years of delay, where he was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Sean Gillis. Sean murdered 8 Louisiana women between 1994 and 2004 in the Baton Rouge metro and surrounding areas. He was arrested without incident at the residence at at Bergen Avenue at 1:30 in the morning in 2004. He is currently incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. Sean Goebel. Goebel kidnapped and murdered at least 3 women along highways in North Carolina and Tennessee during the winter of 1995. In addition, authorities in 10 other states investigated him for numerous other killings committed during the late 1980s and early 1990s. Goebel is currently serving his sentence at the Northeast Correctional Complex in Doe Valley, Tennessee. Francisco Junco. Francisco killed and subsequently burned the corpses of 4 Miami prostitutes during a period around 8 months. Francisco was convicted of all 4 murders and was given a life sentence for each of them. Paul Runge. Paul, who sexually assaulted and murdered at least 6 women and 1 girl between 1995 and 1997 in Illinois, he was initially sentenced to death, was commuted by Governor Pat Quinn in 2011 when capital punishment was abolished in the state. Alfred Gaynor. Alfred, who committed a series of 9 murders in the city of Springfield, Massachusetts from 1995 to 1998. For these crimes, Gaynor was subsequently given 4 sentences of life imprisonment without parole. Jose Guerrero. Jose murdered 3 women in California between 1995 and 1998. The murders went unsolved until 2004, when DNA evidence was found at the crime scenes were linked to him, he was imprisoned for a DUI. He was tried and convicted in 2009 and was sentenced to death. Raymond Johnson. Raymond, who killed his wife and her infant daughter in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2007, shortly after being paroled for a previous manslaughter conviction in 1995. For the latter crimes, Raymond was convicted and sentenced to death and is currently awaiting execution. Tony Amati. Tony, who shot and killed 3 people during a series of thrill killings in LA in 1996, the FBI was brought to find his whereabouts and added him to the FBI's top 10 most wanted men in 1998. Following his arrest, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and is currently serving his sentence in Nevada. Richard Ebonitz. Richard was responsible for the deaths of at least 3 teenage girls in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, and then he abducted and raped a 15-year-old girl in Richland County. Richard has been suspected of other murders and confessed to numerous crimes, and he actually confessed to a bunch of them to his sister before he committed suicide. Ronald Hinton. Between 1996 and 1999, Ronald raped and strangled to death 3 women in the Rogers Park neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois. In 2 of the cases, Ronald worked with accomplices. He pleaded guilty to each murder in 2004 to avoid a death sentence and was subsequently handed down 3 life terms. Joseph Duncan. There is so much to this dude that he deserves an entire video on himself. Duncan had a long history as a violent sexual predator. He committed his first recorded sex crime in 1978 when he was 15 years old. In that incident, he raped a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. This is a tiny excerpt of his crimes. 5 to 8 killed, 3 to 16 raped, 1 to 7 molested, 1 attempted molestation, and 1 to 3 people stalked. Megan Huntsman. Megan murdered 6 of her newborn children shortly after giving birth to them in Utah. She was only found out when someone she was sharing a garage with found a box of a decomposing child inside. On February 12, 2015, she pleaded guilty to 6 counts of first-degree felony murder. Frederick Cox. In the span of a few months in 1997, he attacked 5 women in Orlando, Florida, killing 3. After an initial mistrial, Cox was found guilty at his second trial and sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years for attempted murder. Andrew Cunanan. Andrew murdered 5 people over 3 months from April 27th to July 15th, 1997. His victims included Italian fashion designer Gianni Versace and Chicago real estate developer Lee Milligan. Andrew died by suicide in 1997, 8 days after murdering Versace. Charles Duffy. Charles murdered 3 women in the Atlanta metropolitan area over 6 weeks in the summer of 1997. Having been turned in by his mother, Duffy pleaded guilty and received 2 life sentences for his crimes. Charles made a full confession to the killings of Yeo Kim and another individual. Thus, he skipped a trial and was sentenced to life imprisonment without incident. John Malveaux. John, who committed between 4 or 5 murders around Louisiana from January to October 1997. Following his arrest and confession to the crimes, John pleaded guilty on all counts and was given 4 life terms without the possibility of parole. William Reese, in 2015, was linked via DNA to the 1997 cold case murder of a woman in Oklahoma, for which he was subsequently convicted and sentenced to death. Not long after, he confessed to 3 murders that were associated with Texas killing fields, for which he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in 2022. Paul Reed. Paul was convicted and sentenced to death for 7 murders during 3 fast food restaurant robberies. Paul received 7 death sentences for his convictions, the first 2 coming in 1999. Paul died at the Nashville General Hospital at Meharry. Timothy McGee. Timothy is alleged to be responsible for at least 12 homicides between 1997 and 2001, 3 of which led to his convictions. Timothy is also suspected of at least 10 attempted murders, 4 of which led to his convictions. Due to a new change in California's death sentence laws, Timothy had been transferred to San Quentin's death row. Franklin Alex. Franklin, who committed at least 3 murders, 2 attempted murders, 9 robberies, 2 rapes, and 4 kidnappings during a crime spree in the late 1990s. Most of his crimes occurred at the apartment complexes in Houston. Alex was sentenced to death for one of the murders and executed in 2010. Dwayne Harris. Dwayne was an American serial killer who killed 3 women in Seattle between 1997 and 1998, dumping their bodies near freeways while jailed for a robbery charge. He confessed to the murders and was later sentenced to 94 years imprisonment. Paul DeRusso. Paul murdered 7 young women, including 2 that were pregnant, in the southeastern United States between 1997 and 2003. Of his known victims, they were young, single African-American women. Paul was arrested and charged with 5 counts of murder on June 17, 2003. Ronald Dominique. Ronald murdered at least 23 men and boys in the state of Louisiana between 1997 and 2006. On September 23, 2008, Ronald was found guilty and sentenced to several terms of life imprisonment without parole for his crimes. The FBI stated that Ronald was the most significant serial homicide case in the country over the past 2 decades in terms both of death toll and duration. After accepting a plea bargain from prosecutors, in September of 2008, the court found Ronald guilty on all charges, sentencing him to 8 life imprisonment terms without the possibility of parole. Scott Williams. Scott has been convicted for the murders of 3 women that took place over a period of 9 years. He has also been convicted of crimes against 2 additional women who were not killed. Scott is imprisoned at the Alexander Correctional Institution. Robert Rembert. Robert committed a series of at least 5 murders in Cleveland, Ohio, from 1997 to 2015. He was arrested thanks to DNA profiling, fully admitting his guilt at trial, for which he was sentenced to life in prison, with a chance of parole in 30 years. Kenneth Williams. Kenneth killed 4 people in Arkansas and Missouri, originally sentenced to life without parole for killing a cheerleader in 1998. Kenneth escaped from prison in a 500-gallon barrel of pig slop in 1999. He then shot and killed another man and stole his truck, several miles away from the prison, before unintentionally killing another man in a police chase in Missouri. Kenneth was convicted of the murder he was committing shortly after escaping the prison and was sentenced to death. In 2005, he confessed to committing the other murder in 1998, Williams becoming the last of 4 inmates to be executed in Arkansas in April of 2017. Daniel Jones. Daniel, who raped and stabbed 4 young women to death in Kansas City, Missouri between 1998 and 2001, he was arrested shortly after the final murder, and DNA evidence linked him to the previous crimes, after which he confessed and was given multiple life sentences. Todd Reed. Todd strangled 3 homeless women in Portland, Oregon between April and June 1999. later dumping their bodies in the Forest Park Reserve. He was convicted of these deaths, received 3 terms of life imprisonment. It is unclear in which prison Todd Al Reed is housed in, or if he's even alive. Cary Stayner. Cary was convicted of the murders of 4 women between February and July 1999. The murders occurred in Mariposa County, California, near Yosemite National Park. Cary was sentenced to death of the 4 murders and is still on death row at San Quentin State Prison. John Etchinger. John, who was convicted of killing 3 women and 1 child from 1999 to 2005 in Pennsylvania, which he committed after 2 of the victims had rejected his romantic advances. He was handed 3 death sentences for the latter murders and 1 life sentence for the former, and is currently awaiting execution. Raymond Hopwell. Raymond murdered 5 elderly people and injured several others in Baltimore, Maryland between 1999 and 2005. In a deal with prosecutors, Hopewell pleaded guilty to 5 counts of murder in order to avoid the death penalty and received 4 life sentences. Robert Smallwood. Robert fatally strangled 3 women in Kentucky between 1999 and 2006. He was convicted of the murders, along with additional rape and sentenced to life in prison in October 2007. Michael Mullins. Michael, who murdered 3 women in Memphis, Tennessee between 1999 and 2012 and unsuccessfully tried to kill a 4th woman in Knoxville. He was arrested for the final murder in 2012. His DNA was uploaded to a database which linked him to 3 other crimes, after which he made a full confession and was given multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Alright, I just wanted it to be known that we are starting at the 2000s and working our way till 2023. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Please leave a like if you're, still here with us. Well, me. I'll see you guys at the end of the video. Rodney Bixer. Ronnie strangled 3 women in Kentucky, raped another, and is suspected of drowning a 13-year-old girl. He was sentenced to 40 years imprisonment for these crimes, and provided that he maintains good behavior, he will be released in 2039. Ronald Ward. Ronald murdered at least 3 women and 1 man in the span of several months in 2000. Initially convicted for the murder of Craig Petrich in Montana, he was later linked by DNA evidence to 3 other murders, which had occurred in Arkansas and California. Ronald died serving his sentence in the Montana State Prison in 2014, but the case of his death was not disclosed. Roberto Fernandez. Roberto was posthumously linked to the murders of 3 prostitutes in Miami, Florida from 2000 to 2001. Roberto had been acquitted of the murder in 1996 of shooting his wife. He died in a plane crash in Paraguay before he could be arrested for the crimes. Terry Hankins. Terry killed 5 family members in Mansfield, Texas between October 2000 and August 2001. After fully admitting responsibility, he was convicted of 2 of the murders and was sentenced to death. Terry was executed by lethal injection in 2009. Vicky Jackson. Vicky is an American serial killer who killed at least 10 patients at the Nocona General Hospital in Nocona, Texas between 2000 and 2001. Using the muscle relaxant Mivacron, despite protesting her innocence, she was found guilty on all accounts and sentenced to life imprisonment. Matthew Johnson. Matthew is an American serial killer and rapist who murdered at least 3 female sex workers from 2000 to 2001. He is also suspected in the deaths of another 2 women, but hasn't been charged in their deaths. Johnson was convicted of 3 murders and was sentenced to 180 years in prison. Kevin Taylor. Kevin strangled 4 prostitutes to death in Chicago in 2001. After a would-be 5th victim survived and identified him, Taylor was arrested and sentenced to multiple life terms in 2006. Shelley Brooks. Shelley Brooks is a serial killer who murdered at least 7 women in Detroit, Michigan from 2001 to 2006, though he is suspected of up to 20 murders and possibly more. He was caught thanks to a survivor and fully admitted to his guilt at the trials, for which he was given multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Quincy Allen. Quincy was an American serial killer who killed 4 people between July and August in a crime spree in 2002. He was sentenced to death for his crimes in South Carolina and is currently awaiting execution. William Gibson. William was an American serial killer and rapist who is currently on Indiana's death row for the sexually motivated murders of 2 women in 2002 and 2012, in addition to serving a 65-year sentence for a 3rd murder committed in 2012. A habitual criminal known for his increasingly violent streaks and his handlebar mustache, William claimed responsibility for upwards of 30 additional murders across multiple states, none of which have been confirmed. William Howell. Williams convicted of murdering 7 women in 2003. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in Connecticut history. In November 2017, while already serving a 15-year prison sentence for manslaughter, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences, meaning he was sentenced to 360 years in prison. Larm Price. Price is an American serial killer who murdered 4 immigrants in New York in 2003. Price claimed he carried out the murders in revenge for the September 11th attacks, and said he was driven to kill by a paranoid hatred of Arabs. Despite this claim, only one of his victims was Middle Eastern. He remains incarcerated at the Sullivan Correctional Facility. Samaron Bell. Bell was an American serial killer who was convicted for the murders of his girlfriend and 3 men in California, committed during separate incidences in 2003 and 2004. Sentenced to death for the killings, he remains on death row awaiting execution. Larry Bright. Larry was an American serial killer responsible for the deaths of at least 8 women between the ages of 30 and 41 in central Illinois. The murders occurred between July 2003 and October 2004 in Illinois. Scott Kimball. Scott is a convicted serial killer, conman, and fraudster from Boulder County, Colorado, who murdered at least 4 people over a 2-year period. Investigators strongly suspect him in as many as 21 unsolved killings. For the first year of his murder activity, he worked as an informant for the FBI. Charles Severance, whose crimes took place in Virginia between 2003 and 2014, he was convicted by a Virginia court in 2016 of 3 shooting deaths and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 48 years. Todd Kohlhepp. Todd was an American sex offender and serial killer convicted of murdering 7 people in South Carolina between 2003 and 2016. In addition, Kohlhepp kidnapped at least 1 woman, raped another, and claims to have killed many more. Eugene McWaters. Eugene was an American serial killer and rapist who murdered 3 homeless women in Port Salamo, Florida, from March to May 2004. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but in 2014, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment on technicality. He is currently incarcerated at Taylor Correctional Institution in Florida. Nicholas Wiley. Nicholas was an American serial killer and sex offender who murdered at least 3 women in Syracuse, New York in 2004. He claimed to have killed a total of 7 people, although his claims were never corroborated. For his known crimes, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Robert Hayes. Robert was an American serial killer who had been convicted of 3 murders in Daytona Beach, Florida, between December 2005 and February 2006. DNA tests have also linked him to a 4th murder committed in March 2016. In addition, he remains the prime suspect in the murder of another woman in December 2007. In February 2022, Hayes was convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder. In the following month, he was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kermit Gosnell. Kermit provided abortions at his clinic in West Pennsylvania. He was convicted of the murders of 3 infants who were born alive after using drugs to induce birth, the manslaughter of 1 woman during an abortion procedure, and of several other medically related crimes. He is sentenced to life in prison without parole. Samuel Cooper. Samuel is an American serial killer who murdered 5 men in North Carolina between 2006 and 2007. Convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, Samuel was spared a death sentence and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Sean Great. Sean is an American serial killer and rapist sentenced to death for the murders of 5 young women in and around northern Ohio from 2006 to 2016. Convicted of 2 accounts of aggravated murder on May 7, 2018 in Ashland County. Pleaded guilty to 2 additional murders on March 1, 2019. He was sentenced to death and is scheduled for execution in 2025. Joe Brandt. Joe killed 1 woman in New Orleans, but is suspected of killing at least 3 from October 2007 to September 2008. In the then post-Hurricane Katrina environment, Joe was on prison for burglary charges when the other cases finally caught up to him. He eventually confessed and pleaded guilty to the other 3 murders and is still awaiting sentencing as of 2021. Gary Hilton. Gary is an American serial killer responsible for 4 known homicides between 2007 and 2008, committed in 3 states, all of which occurred within the premise of national forest. Gary was sentenced to death in Florida. Anthony Sawell. Anthony was convicted in 2011 of murdering 11 women whose bodies were discovered at his Cleveland, Ohio home in 2009. After being sentenced to death for the murderers, Anthony died in prison from a terminal illness. Robert Gleason. Robert was sentenced to death and executed in Virginia for 2 separate murders of 2 of his cellmates. Robert was already serving a life sentence for another murderer. He was an execution volunteer who vowed to continue killing in prison if he was not put to death. Capital punishment was abolished in Virginia in 2021, making Robert the last person to be executed in Virginia. Kimberly Saenz is a former licensed practitioner nurse and a convicted serial killer. She was convicted of killing several patients at the Texas Dialysis Center by injecting bleach into their dialysis lines. Michael Johnson. Michael is an American serial killer who murdered at least 4 women in Chicago's South Side between 2008 and 2010. Michael, despite being born with a deformity in his right hand, strangled each of the women to death. After failing to kill a 5th victim, who later pinpointed him to police, Michael was arrested and sentenced to 100 years imprisonment on 1 count of murder. Anthony Garcia. Former medical doctor, he was convicted of 2 separate double murders committed in 2008 and 2013 in Nebraska. Garcia was arrested in July 2013 and went to trial in October of 2016. He was found guilty on all counts and was later sentenced to death. John Eatwell. John, who murdered 4 residents of the Hawthorne neighborhood in LA in 2010, he had previous convictions for violent crimes dating back to the 1980s and in the 1990s and 2000s. Following a guilty plea in 2019, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without parole. Antonio Rodriguez. Antonio is an American serial killer, convicted of raping and killing 3 women from November to December 2010, all of which occurred within a 10-block radius of a neighborhood. For his crimes, Antonio was sentenced to 3 life terms, which he is currently serving at a state correctional institution. Michael Madison. Michael, who is known to have committed the murders of at least 3 women over a 9-month period in 2012, he was arrested and charged with the crimes in 2013 and was sentenced to death in 2016. He is currently being held on death row. Stephen Gordon. Stephen killed at least 4 sex workers in California from 2013 to 2014. Convicted and sentenced to death for his crimes, Gordon admitted responsibility for at least 1 further murder, for which he had never been charged. As of May 2022, he remains on death row. Darren Vann. Darren was arrested on October 18, 2014, for the murder of 19-year-old Africa Hardy at a Motel 6 in Indiana. He confessed to the murders of 6 other female victims as well. James Ritchie. Throughout 2016, Ritchie murdered upwards of 5 individuals in and around Alaska, most of whom were in parks or along bike paths. He always committed his murders at night, often around midnight or a short time after. Ritchie was killed during a shootout with police officers in downtown Anchorage on November 12, 2016. Wheeler Weaver. Wheeler Weaver lured his victims using Tag, a dating app, and murdered 3 women and attempted to kill a 4th between August 2016 and November 2016. One of the victims' sisters created a fake account and lured Wheeler Weaver to meeting before notifying police. He will be he will be eligible for parole in 140 years. Wheeler Weaver maintained his innocence, claiming he was framed. Lawrence Mills. Lawrence is an American serial killer who murdered 2 women, one of whom was pregnant, by running them over with his car in Detroit, Michigan, between October and December 2017. After being arrested in 2020, he was sentenced to 28 to 48 years in prison. He is also suspected of at least 2 other hit and runs, one of which was fatal. He is now imprisoned at Bellamy Creek Correctional Facility. Retta Mays. Retta is an American convicted serial killer who murdered at least 7 elderly military veterans over a span of 11 months, between July 2017 and June 2018, by injecting them with lethal doses of insulin. Stuart Weldon. Stewart murdered 3 women in Springfield, Massachusetts in late 2017 and early 2018. After being arrested for kidnapping and attempting to kill a woman in 2018, authorities investigated his property and found the bodies of 3 victims. Weldon pleaded guilty to the murders on September 28, 2021, and was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. Raymond Escobar. Raymond killed 7 people during a month-long killing spree between Texas and California in 2018, most of whom were homeless. After pleading guilty, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, committing a suspected 8th murder while in prison in 2023. D'Angelo Martin. D'Angelo is an American serial killer who murdered 4 women and raped 2 others in Detroit between February 2018 and June 2019. Martin was arrested on June 7, 2019 and was sentenced to 45 to 70 years in prison. He is currently housed at the Richard A. Handon Correctional Facility. Kenyelle Brown. Kenyelle was an American criminal and prime suspect in a series of murders which occurred in 3 cities. On February 24th, his whereabouts were discovered, but during the arrest attempt, Brown shot himself in the head. He survived his injuries and was taken to the hospital, where he died 4 days later due to complications. Ryan Blunston. Ryan is an American spree killer and arsonist who murdered 3 women in Oroville, California, between May and June 2020. His modus operandi typically consisted of murdering clients he worked for at his tree trimming job. Ryan was caught by a SWAT team while attempting to murder another man with a hatchet. He was later found guilty of the murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. So that was it. Phew! Guys, I'm almost in tears. It's finished. If you stuck around this far, thank you so much. It means a lot to me. I'll probably be taking a little hiatus for a little while to rest up and get some fresh stuff made. I have pages and pages of ideas, so don't worry, I'll definitely have something coming down the pipeline. It may not be like this video, but I'll always try to make something better. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.